Say two things. Obviously, probably the most provocative of his ideas that's causing a lot of anxiety, even in the stock market. Like if you look at real estate, some of the rent freeze stuff, which for obvious, like economists hate that kind of thing. They think it's, various forms of rent control is a terrible idea. We understand why investors in real estate don't like it either. On the other hand, and so we talked about that, but on the other hand, my main takeaway from that interview is like, yes, like if you're a young democratic socialist, of course, you're going to be really excited about the Mamdani candidacy. But he comes off in a way that if you're sort of like I would say like normie, center-left democratic liberal or something, and you're sort of the typical person who works in an office in New York City, like he is really good and really talented at not seeming like someone who will be a threat to you. And I think that when you look at the results last night, that's like, to my mind, like the really striking part is that how broad that coalition was, et cetera. Because we know that there are parts of the city that have trended that way for a while. Obviously, AOC's victory in 2018, that was a stunner, but that was niche. This was the entire city, right? This was kind of everyone across, huge swaths, much bigger numbers. He did well in sort of the, white educated areas, but also he did well in more non-white areas that had trended more towards Trump in the most recent election. So he clearly did a really good job of sort of overcoming the fact that many people would say he has pretty radical politics. And it's like, well, actually, he can sort of like talk very fluently about policy. He comes off as a very thoughtful guy. And he really, I think, ended up like disarming a lot of the critics.
Yeah, he's also ticked off a lot of billionaires. And there's a great story that's among the most read on the Bloomberg that talks about Wall Street decrying at the hot commie summer after his surprising win last night. And so, Dan Loeb, hedge fund billionaire, it's officially a hot commie summer. And there's
it's sort of corny. But you know what I mean? Like,
but there's a ton of them coming out.
But on the other hand, like if I were running for mayor and the thing's like, oh, he's upset a lot of billionaires, it's like, bring it on, right? Like, seriously, like if you're going to say, oh, he's really ticked off a lot of billionaires, that's like about as good of that's one of probably the best things you can say. Most people aren't billionaires.
So is he, there's another one, a New York power broker, Kathy Wild, and she's connected business titans across all different industries in New York City, and saying that he terrifies taxpayers and employers. I mean, are employers going to be running for Florida? Is the rest of Wall Street going to run for Florida?
Here's my thoughts on this. And maybe I'm like a little biased, but this is my take, and maybe I'll end up being totally wrong. New York City is the best city in the world. Everybody knows that. Even during COVID or aftermath, when people like New York City is dead, and they're like, oh, we're going to go to Miami. No one really moved to Miami. They went there for like the minimum amount of time they could to maybe change tax status, and a bunch of people came back. I'm going to Miami. Now, on the other, so it's like, if you're like, there aren't really going to be that many people like, oh, I'm upset about the mayor, I'm upset about taxes, I'm going to move. But if the quality of life in the city degrades, if people perceive, oh, the public transit is not running as well, it's not as clean, there's more crime in the city, the schools aren't as good, then of course you're going to have people leaving. So my gut would be, and again, maybe this is just my sort of pro-New York bias, my gut is that very few people are going to leave because they're upset about the mayor per se. This is where all the action is. If you want to talk to someone interesting,
it's probably not the first mayor that people have been upset about either.
People are always upset about they're going to be upset about. So like, I don't think that is. On the other hand, if he can't implement a vision of he says it's going to make this city more affordable. People expect the quality of services to be good. People expect transit to be good. If he can't deliver on that, then I would expect that, at the margins, more people leave because the city is less appealing. But if the quality of life in New York City is roughly sustained, or maybe hopefully improves, then I don't think you're going to have like some mass exodus just like on principle. It's still New York City.
Well, just a couple weeks before he was on Odd Lots, he was on Surveillance. I was filling in for Paul Sweeney then with Tom Keene. I asked Zohran Mamdani about the label of democratic socialist. Check out what he had to say.
I embrace the label because ultimately I do identify myself as a democratic socialist. And I think, that the thing that New Yorkers hate more than a politician they disagree with is one that they cannot trust. And I think it's important to be honest about how we're coming to this politics and also what that label means to me, which is ultimately that each and every New Yorker has what they need to live a dignified life, and that it's city government's responsibility to provide that. And I think we have a general consensus on many of those building blocks in our society, whether it's public education or libraries or sanitation. But then there are certain places where we tend to believe that these are necessary parts of living a dignified life, and yet we allow people to be priced out of it. And I think housing is one of the most obvious examples of that.
Okay, so that was our interview with Zohran Mamdani back on May 6th. He was on Bloomberg surveillance. The housing part is something I wanted to hit with you because there's this idea of rent freezes, which he ran on and talked a lot about. But if you think about this from a supply and demand perspective, how do you get people to build more housing, which is what the city needs, if you don't provide the incentive that people are going to pay for it? And if you say, okay, well, if we're going to build the affordable housing, we can't raise the rent on it.
Well, I would say a few things. So one is he's not completely doctrinaire about how it all has to be rent-regulated housing. And in various interviews, he has talked about there is a role for market rate development. He's talked about upzoning, all of the things that wonks like.
The abundance stuff.
And he's like, so he's not... So it's not like a particularly radical vision on housing. He's talked about market rate housing. The other thing I noticed in that video, he's wearing a suit. He's smiling. He's really, and then you say these things like dignified life, etc. Like you just see in that clip, watching it just now, why someone would see that. It's like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, look, there's a lot of people and they hear like socialist, etc. And I get like, people find that to be very provocative or scary or radical or whatever. But he did not come off as a radical in that clip, right? He comes off as like a pretty serious, likable politician. And I think what he said too about like sort of being genuine, it's like, the fact that he didn't run away from his past, that he didn't run away, I do think that is a pretty big deal these days. And that in an era of social media, et cetera, people can sort of sniff out a fraud or sniff out a phony or whatever. And he certainly doesn't come off as one. And he probably made trade-offs. And he probably said, there are certain things that maybe aren't as appealing to some, but he didn't run away from them. And I think it helped put together a package of like, okay, like maybe I don't agree with him on X or Y, but he seems like a legitimate, serious guy.